Thank you. Just about good afternoon, I think. Firstly, I'd like to thank IHF, Dr. Curtis, the chair, Vahid, Dr. Bobo, for inviting me to speak. I'm probably not your natural speaker at an event like this. I'm looking at the whole issue from a point of view of an outsider. And I really just want to posit some ideas and really start some explorations about what I see from outside. I've never practiced in Iran, so my knowledge would be rather limited in terms of technicality. But I want to speak about generalities, really, and then look at specific particulars with a view to doing that. And seeing as though this is a mixed audience, I can't resist but to carry out an experiment on you. Whenever there are architects and non-architects in an audience, I always ask them to imagine that they're traveling in a fantastically modern car in the beautiful countryside of their choosing, be it France, Iran, Italy, wherever they happen to find beauty. And in the distance, they see a beautiful hill town to which they drive towards. And once they're there, they come across a beautifully grand building, nicely proportioned, built with beautiful materials, whereupon they enter a restaurant where people are elegantly dressed, there's nice table linen, and the food looks extremely presentable. And that's the end of the experiment. I'm sure most of you, unless you're architects, imagined that you were looking at a countryside or landscape that was not dotted by office parks, by factories, by squalor. The town most probably looked traditional, something resembling a Renaissance hill town. The building of the restaurant was an elegantly 19th century, most probably, building. It had nothing to do with Corbusier or Mies van der Rohe or anybody the other side of the 20th century or post-industrial era. And the people were not dressed in shorts and baseball caps or chinos with slogans in front of the baseball cap, and the cutlery was certainly not plastic. But if you've had the misfortune of an architectural education after the 1950s, you would imagine everything the other way around. And that is really where the problem is. So my exploration is really to do whether technology or what drives you to that destination is an influence on your perception of beauty, or whether it should influence your perception of beauty. And where is the human element in all of this? We talked about culture and progression and progressiveness. Language is a very beautiful thing. And language can be played. Nowadays, you can do anything you want, you can build anything you want, you can destroy anything you want and build something in its place and be able to justify it philosophically, culturally, by convoluted language. So is technology a simple means of taking you where you want to go? Is novelty really the paradigm? Is newness the paradigm? Should things be novel? We were asked, why should we have a Persian architecture? Actually, that's a very good question. Why should we have a modernist architecture is another question. Is the city an organic or a sustainable habitat based on human scale? Or is it based on zoned mechanistic processes that use humans as elements within an algorithm and abstract notions? Is the house a machine for living in? Which is still the mantra by which architects design buildings today? Is it a Corbusian machine habitat? Or another natural organism that should be built to human scale with natural materials? And finally, really, do the way we build, eat, live, work, marry, die, fall in love, bear children, fit into a holistic continuum, that our identity and our aspirations are shaped by it? Is our history, culture represented in the pattern of habitation and in the physical build form? Language as I said, is a wonderful thing. This is a building by a very eminent architect, an ennobled one, internationally renowned. And you can see it says, "We are guided by the sensitivity to the culture and climate of a place." And you can see really by the poor buildings in the foreground, this is a climate where it rains a lot. There are loads of chimneys. Stone is the predominant way of building, which has been for millennia. And the building, which has landed from Mars, bears no resemblance to the culture or the climate of the place. And a lot of the slides that we've been seeing about Tehran kind of reminds me of things like that. And architects who for millennia have been basically playing with proportion and geometry are suddenly faced with playing with digits, with computers, with concrete, reinforced concrete, and the whole specter of practice has become something completely disjointed and separated from the natural order of things that an architect should be in touch with, and therefore culture and humanism in kind of that order. The task of finding, the task of finding fractals, abstract digital patterns, formulations in nature, and then somehow injecting a posteriori conceived object like a kind of a Frankenstein monster where you kind of inject it and then suddenly it comes to life and becomes culturally relevant, has become a preoccupation of many, many architects. At a time when the formation of architecture in terms of a discipline in the 18th century, and then that which led later on to the creation of École des Beaux-Arts and École de Polytechnique, which then in Iran, the separation and the formulation of the profession into an academic body, nature was really the way, and this is Logier's famous sketch, where the architect is the little cherub with all the drawing material on his back. He's pointing towards nature as the basis of what he should be looking at in terms of his aesthetic production, has changed to this, and again, another recognizable building. So we have entered into an age of anonymity, where unless somebody tells us with a caption where we are, we wouldn't recognize where we are. And anything is possible and everything is possible. You can actually enter a climate of 50 degrees, walk into a ski resort, go up a chalet, drink hot chocolate, and on the way down break your leg too. The only difference is that Air Glacier will not come and pick you up in a very chic helicopter. You will be probably bussed or broncoed off the back of the tradesman entrance of a shopping mall in the center of Dubai. And these kind of anomalies and cultural mishmashes are appearing all over the place. And somehow they are being accepted and are becoming the norm. And what it does is actually raises further philosophical questions around the practice and why we do things. Things like this, which I actually call parasites, because there are things which kind of appear in order, like organisms, to invade another organism, appear on the side of buildings or at top of the buildings, or actually they're preconceived as parasites, which is even more perverse. Somebody actually funded that building, they spent millions building it and years, and that's a culture that somehow sees itself in the production of a building like that. Leon Krier, a mentor and a influential urbanist and architect in the latter part of the 20th century, and he still lives obviously in the 21st century, very nicely summarized this kind of dilemma whereby traditional pluralism, how it has actually changed into modernist pluralism, whereby you see the fragments of each is put together in order to create a monstrous whole, and how we have gone from form, which is on the right-hand side, where you could name the objects of a palace, a cooling tower, a factory, a home, to uniform objects, which unless you have a caption, you wouldn't know whether one was a vase, or it's a factory, or it's a petrol station. and so on and so forth. And how we've started even celebrating fragmentation of history, fragmentation of scale, and raised it to the level of giving it a prize. This is a competition winner, again, by a very famous firm of architects. And the comment of the jury, which is quite scandalous, actually, it says, the design preserves as much possible of the dignity of the present building. And a monument adding a new object to the site. Now, if that's not convoluted language, I don't know what is. Now, I was going to talk about really how classical architecture and vernacular architecture can be relevant still, and how architecture conceived not as a object of commodification, but as a practice of a humanist art can still survive in the 21st century. But I think what I wanted to do really was to say that Iranian culture, as far as I can see, like many rich cultures, have all the essential elements that make up the majority of architecture. The majority of architecture is not really condensed into what is modernist or classical or whatever. There are basically two sorts of practices whereby you have a vernacular tradition which exists within Iran. It actually exists in many, many different countries, exactly the same kind of preoccupation, whereby architecture is born out of the contingencies of the landscape, out of the contingencies of the materials that are at your disposal, and also out of building traditions. And traditions are important. And those traditions are utterly changeable, and they evolve. It is not that they are static. I think Dr. Borbor mentioned, why do we need to, why these buildings are worthless or something to that effect, that they have no architectural value. They do have architectural value. They are about continuity. Modernism did not come out of continuity, unfortunately. It came out of a revolution in building and in design and building, because it came out of out of an industrial production. So if you believe in continuity, you have to believe in the past. If you believe in the continuity, you have to believe in the future. It's only if you don't believe in continuity that you basically just eternally live in the present. And what you posit and present as something that is for the future is a sham, really. It is just another novel way of presenting the present. So you see here the vernacular tradition of Iran is by and large within the same milieu of the vernacular traditions of other countries. We have adobe architecture, we have climatic conditions in the north, and even you see different kinds of buildings, different countries. So there's a trend and a kind of a strand that runs through vernacular architecture. The same is for classical architecture. You have different classicisms and you have different vernacular architectural traditions. And all of this in different parts of the world up until the advent of modernism had influence on what people did, how they lived, how they occupied space, how they conceived of themselves and their own identity. And somehow we're expected that in the latter part of the 20th century or early 21st century, if we are to be people, if we are to live, die, get married, have children, have to kind of just throw all of these things out and have to be thoroughly modern. And if we do, we're either what you were saying is culturalist, or we are progressivist, I think, which is the term that you used, which is, again, comes back to the language. One is putting one against the other. If you're a culturalist, you're backward. If you're a progressivist, you're forward. And, traditionalists are not immune to the same kind of disasters and horrors that modern architecture has put in. I mean, there you see mass building of sham traditional architecture in China. You see, this is a famous villa in Kuwait. It's called Villa Akbar. I always go past it. Every time I take a picture, because I just can't resist. It's like looking at a macabre scene or a horror movie. Architects, I think, have kind of lost their way. This again is a famous calligraphy, which print, which shows the allegory of the bad architect. He's actually been blinded and has had his hands cut off and set into the wilderness because he has forgotten how to actually design. So in Iran, we have probably as rich a background, as rich a culture, as rich a morphology, typology of buildings, every building type that can be transformed and transferred to a new condition. And what we choose to do is pursue a modernity that has no relationship to the host culture. And that's, I wanted to come kind of full circle with that. Basically, what I saw this morning kind of reaffirmed the belief that I have that what happened in Iran was no different to what happened in Europe in the early part of the 20th century. And I agree with Dr. Madanipour, is that Iran went through the same hiatus, ideological, cultural angst, and of forging an identity. And the architecture that was born out of it, although it's caricaturized as being pastiche or not relevant, was actually very important in forming the nation's view of itself, as well as forming the psyche that would inhabit the building and accept it as its built environment. And then exactly the same thing happened in Sweden in the 1920s, when right up to the end of the 19th century, Sweden was basically part of the Renaissance tradition. Buildings were being copied. Famous Scandinavian architects were practicing all over the world. And they were not, the tradition of architects practicing in different parts of the world is nothing new. So an architect going from Germany to the US, or going from Denmark to Greece, for example, like the Hansen brothers, who went to Greece and forged a new Greek identity in the 18th century by bringing back Hellenistic architecture to Greece, played exactly the same role that they played in Iran. So the Swedish architects, this is Gunnar Asplund's famous library, which is a masterpiece of world architecture. This was born out of a preoccupation of the Swedish architects in order to forge their identity in a brave new century. And you cannot call these buildings classical. You cannot call them modernist. They all came out of the Beaux-Arts tradition, as did Foroughi and the people who practice in Iran. If you look at the plans, actually, which Dr. Borba was showing today, the plan of the Bank Melli, which Foroughi designed, is a very basic Beaux-Arts plan. It is not a modernist plan. It is not a domino building of Corbusian dimension. And these architects also, as well as people like Sirot, Godard, who practiced in Iran, or Gevorkian, they were all Beaux-Arts trained, as was Adolf Loos or Hoffman. Their basic education was a Beaux-Arts education, but they decided to explore with the themes of expression and the way the architects are expressed. So what was happening in Iran in the 1920s, almost contemporaneous, was exact replica of what's happening in Sweden. And buildings, magnificent buildings, and no less a magnificent building in Tehran emerged, for example. Okay, that's tough. And you can see the product. This is Woodland Cemetery by Asplund, and Viborg Museum, the cinema in Gothenburg, Högsta City Hall. These are all 1920s, 1930s buildings, in which Swedish identity was forged in terms of, and then you can see the gradual diminution of the Beaux-Arts tradition in the fact that the pediment is almost like nondescript here, and the colonnade has become totally modernist. The Woodland Cemetery, which is another famous Siegfried Leverance's chapel, the Aspelund's chapel, and the Stockholm halls, and then to this. So I think it's worthwhile examining what happened in the generation of, say, Huns, Fouroughis, Godard, Sirou, Goverkian. I haven't seen any serious research apart from historiography that simply just presents the building. I think there's room for serious research to see why have we ended up with this? What makes the thing on the left relevant or the thing on the right relevant? Why is that a valid expression of something that should happen in the center of Tehran? And why are these objects discarded as things of history in the past, that they should be just preserved in aspects? And that's how we should look at them. We should look at them, they say, it's very nice, beautiful, let's preserve it. Oh, don't even demolish it. You know, it's a sacrilege to demolish it. But to continue building like that, oh my God, no, no way. You can't do that. And you know, how we've gone from that to this, and how is this, which is the way sprawl and rapid urbanization is taking over our cities, and objects of that nature are appearing. And again, going back to the vernacular, and we think, you know, people have very short memory or very convenient memory. These kind of things that appear as extremely innovative and modern and forward-looking objects are all happening all over the world at the same time. There's nothing new. It's only sold as new. It's only sold as novel. It's only sold as something that you do. You see that's a new celebrated building in Tehran. This is some mountain lodges, another housing scheme in Paris. These things go through trends. It's like barcode architecture. You see these kind of barcode facades on buildings that happen all the time. And then this is the version of the Villa Akbar in Tehran. And it's not only in terms of architecture. I think the other serious exploration should be the persistence of, and that's my preoccupation with Intbah, is really the place of traditional urban design and planning. Because in Iran, Vilradius and the Corbusian tradition is still alive, while it's been discredited in Western Europe in terms of urban planning. And things like that are popping up all over the suburbs and the surrounding areas of Tehran. Whereas low-rise, high-density development is where Europe is going. Localism is where Europe is going. And we're kind of the same happens in Korea, I must say, and in some other rapid urbanization areas like in India. And really, the choice is not what is at the back or what is at the front. The choice is about continuity from one to the other. And I think everybody has shown the buildings that I wanted to show today to see how there was a vain attempt or a faltered attempt at somehow bringing a sense to the architecture and giving it the spark that the Swedish did in the early part of the 20th century to leave us with a legacy from which we can actually continue and move forward. And I think people like, say, Hun and Fouroughi were instrumental in doing that. Thank you so much.